Hey folks, Phil Gallagher here for a deep dive on cloud post archetypes in Legacy. This is going to be sort of a primer, matchup, sideboarding, deck building video. It was the original intention for from the donor for this to be an article, but I'm having website issues right now, so we're doing sort of a video super primer on 12 post. 12 post is like quote unquote because some of the versions play more or less copies of the various postcards, with Thespian Stage often being the honorary 12th or 13th post, sometimes more in some cases. So the layout for this video is we're going to look over 4 different deck lists, and we're going to sort of look over the advantages and disadvantages of each type. Then we're going to talk about what sort of things make up your deck list, and sort of like how do you go and build a deck if you are looking to deviate from stock lists and actually make your own version of post. And we're going to talk about opening hands and sort of how do you evaluate what your hand is doing when you're playing a post deck. And then finally we'll go into sort of like your sideboarding and gameplay matchups versus macro archetypes. That is, how do you approach control matchups, tempo matchups, and combo matchups. So, part 1, the deck lists. It used to be that 12-post deck lists all look relatively similar to each other, but that has very much changed really in the past 6 months or so, I'd say in particular. We've gotten some new cards for the archetype in like Golos, Manifold Key, Ugin. I guess Olamog's a little older than that now, but 12 post has changed a lot recently. So version 1 of the deck is what I have here, and it's the Chalice of the Void deck list. Chalice of the Void used to be one of the like premier ways to build Cloud Post, but now Chalice of the Void has become optional instead of being one of the like linchpin pieces of the archetype. Chalice of the Void fights over some of the cards that you might want to play in this archetype, such as Manifold Key, Pithing Needle, and Candelabra. So Chalice isn't a slam dunk in this colorless deck that has a bunch of soul lands. And that might be relatively surprising to a lot of people, but that's the truth. This is sort of a traditional, safe 12-post build. The 12th post in this deck list is a Thespian Stage rather than a Vesuva, as we can see here. So this version looks to combo Manifold Key with Grim Monolith or Thran Dynamo to go and produce a decent amount of artifact-based mana when you don't have time to set up your land-based plan. The Cloud Post stuff produces an absurd amount of mana as the game goes really long, but something you need to keep in mind is if you're playing against a combo deck, sometimes you need that mana earlier. So this gives you another way to produce a lot of mana. This build is sort of in between in many ways because it hedges in a few directions. You can see that we have a handful of lock pieces here. We have some Sorcerous Spyglasses, which are primarily there for Wasteland, but they also do damage against plenty of the things in the format, especially Oko. What might be unusual to you at first glance is that we do have 4 copies of Eldrazi Temple here to power up the Thought-Knot Seers and the Olamogs a little bit earlier. Let me make sure I haven't forgotten anything else in this build. Sometimes there's a sneaky Emrakul off screen. So this version has a lot of top end in the form of non-creature spells. So this version has both Ugins, All is Dust, in addition to the Olamog. This one kind of hedges. It's not all in on anything. You're not all in on artifact-based mana. You're not all in on Golos. You're not all in on Olamog. This is sort of a safe version. And it has the traditional Karn Wishboard that we're used to seeing. My version here has an Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, in the sideboard. That's not necessarily something that you have to have in the deck, but it's a common inclusion, either main deck or sideboard, because it gets you out of some weird spots. So this is version 1 that has chalice. Version 2, and I'm going to just make sure we get all of this on screen, because that's a common problem with this deck list. Version 2 is the dedicated Golos post list. So if you notice, a lot of the curve is shifted this direction with the deck. So this version is playing Candelabra, and a lot of them. It has 3 candlesticks, as well as 4 manifold keys, and 4 grim monoliths. Something you might initially miss is that this untaps another target artifact. This is an artifact. So you can use Candelabra, untap like 2 cloud posts, use manifold key, and 1 of that mana, untap the Candelabra, do it again. This can produce crazy amounts of mana very quickly. You do lose out on something by playing this deck list. This deck list is going to be one of the best versions at going big and going above your opponents. Because as the game goes on, good lord, you are going to generate a lot of mana, and you're going to be able to play this stuff relatively consistently. But compare this to this list, where you have the 2 Trinispheres and the 2 Chalice of the Voids to bridge the early game. We're going to talk about bridging to the late game a little bit more later in the video, but this deck is going to be a little bit softer to combo as opposed to some other versions of the deck, because you are going and focusing more on your mana and less on what your opponent can do. This version of the deck is essentially going and saying, hey, I'm going to go bigger than you as the game goes on. Can you beat this onslaught? When you go heavier on Golos, Cascading Cataracts is something that you should consider. It is an indestructible land. That alone gives it some credit. But you can use this to add 5 mana in any combination to your mana pool, which then turns Golos into sort of this weird, gambly, draw 3 kind of card, which can be pretty powerful. There are a lot of situations where you don't actually need Cascading Cataracts, because Golos most of the time is either just going to ramp you towards your threats, or it's just going to go and find the Eye of Ugin, which is going to be your primary win condition against any deck that is just going slowly. So, sort of version 1, a little better against combo. Version 2, better if you're expecting a little bit less combo, and you can just beat a deck by going bigger than it. You know, if you're playing against some deck like Death and Taxes, and you just like play an Ugin and you know, -3 it or something like that, and just get a 5-for-1, then you going bigger than your opponent is absolutely devastating. Note that in this shell, Ugin is probably better than in the previous shell, because due to the increased amount of mana acceleration you have, and to a slightly lesser extent also the ability to just play Golos earlier and fish for more stuff, you have the ability to realistically use this as a piece of mana acceleration as well. It's kind of weird to say that about a 6 mana card, but it's the truth. Ugin really lets you vomit your hand. So when you get this thing into play, anything that costs 2 or less is now free. That's a good portion of your deck. So there's a lot of times where you can luck into, like, say, a turn 3 Ugin. That's not even all that lucky. That's pretty easy to do. You can play a turn 3 Ugin, you know, get a candle, untap some lands, your other stuff is cheaper, and just, like, go and absolutely just devastate your opponent. To compensate for the worst Game 1 combo matchup, you will often see these decks play some sideboard specific combo hate card other than just the Tarn targets. So this one is playing Sphere of Resistance, which gives you something that annoys pretty much any combo deck. Version 3 is much more recent, and this is the green-based version. So, as I've been playing it when I play the green version usually runs Pithing Needle. So this version often doesn't run Pithing Needle because it's playing Chalice of the Void. This version doesn't run Pithing Needle because you're trying to use your turn 1 if you only have 1 mana to set up one of these. Or if you have 2 mana, you're just kind of doing this most of the time anyway. Grim Monolith plays with a synergy with all of these cards, and Sorcerer Spyglass is your Pithing Needle. But in this deck list that is looking to play more non-soul lands, you really can afford to just play turn 1 Pithing Needle. So a primary difference between this list and the others that we're looking at is I think it's 7, I didn't count beforehand, 3, 6, 7, is about 7 forests. Those allow you to play around wastelands for a couple of turns, and they allow you to play things that cheat lands directly into play. Golos is something that I have a huge amount of respect for. It's my favorite card in the 12-post archetype. And Elvish Rejuvenator is kind of like baby Golos. So on turn 3, you can just like play this Rejuvenator and hit like another Cloud Post. And it will all of a sudden jump you to maybe Golos or Primeval Titan the next turn. The green version has some increased consistency, but opens itself up to some things. So Crop Rotation opens you up to counterspells being significantly better against you, but Rejuvenator and Primetime put lands directly into play. And let me tell you, control decks aren't really going to beat an Eye of Ugin that are in play. That just is not a thing that tends to occur. So the green version is sort of like the utility version, where between Once Upon a Time, Crop Rotation, and Expedition Map, you have a greater access to your cards, with also some ability to play around Wasteland in initial turns while you go and set up. In this archetype, being able to dump lands directly into play is incredibly powerful when they're not just a basic land. You know, if you look at all the lands in this deck, getting extra posts in play, like every one of those is just so valuable. Another weakness of this deck, though, is that getting green is sometimes difficult. And you may have to choose between playing towards having more mana or playing towards being able to cast a Primeval Titan. That can be a touch awkward. One of the things that the green Rejuvenator list does that I really like, though, is Summoning Trap. So if your opponent has played against Post before, they understand exactly how scary Golos is. So you go and you cast this Rejuvenator or Golos that is going to get you some land. And your opponent goes, I'm going to daze that. All of a sudden, you Summoning Trap, and you may end up with something that is far worse for your opponent in play. Because this version is playing Summoning Trap, Kozilek often gets the nod here, because like you can Summoning Trap for this, and then whatever cards you have left in your hand serve as a way to like protect this card or stop your opponent from whatever else you're doing. This card does have some restrictions over other cards in that you do need double colorless to cast it. But if you made it to 10 mana without having double colorless, like, have you just been Vesuviing forests the whole game? I don't even know how that happened. The other thing that the green opens you up for is better cards in the sideboard. You get access to Krosan Grip, which is pretty devastating against certain archetypes. Cough, D&D again, cough, cough. As well as Veil of Summer. I probably don't need to tell you that that card is good. Again, though, notice the lack of interaction versus combo in Game 1. We essentially have Bojuka Bog. Otherwise, we are looking to race combo in Game 1. So this version of the deck has opted to play both Spheres and Thorns to compensate for that, as well as playing Ancient Tomb, to just have one more soul land to help power these out early. So if you look for actual soul lands in this version of the deck, you don't see the Ancient Tomb and City of Traders that you're seeing in other versions of the build. Those have been replaced with basic lands to cast all of these green cards. My opinion of the green-based deck is that it is potentially as good as the colorless versions, but it still requires tuning. We're going to look at a wildly different take on the green deck list that I have just labeled as 12 post-Japan. Because Japanese tournaments have a reputation for being, well, spicy, I think is the way that Reddit would put it. So I know, like, I have a 5-0 with a deck list just like this one. I know Orem does, and I think a few other people have picked up 5-0s with this deck list. So it has potential. In case you're going to copy one of these deck lists, note, I do not advise putting Emrakul the Promised End into any of your deck lists. I don't think that that card is particularly good. It's 2 more mana to real actual factual Emrakul, and Ulamog tends to be very, very good against any fair legacy deck. The idea with Emrakul the Promised End is that you can cast it relatively early. If you've cast a handful of things that have gone to your graveyard, you know, you get instants off Once Upon a Time and crop rotation, you can crack your expedition map, put an artifact in there, and this can give you like some outs versus combo. You know, like you play against Ant, for example, and you take one of their turns, you can probably ruin them pretty good, you know, blow their rituals, make them Thoughtseize themselves, that sort of thing. But I found in practice just about every time that I've drawn Emrakul, I just wished it was a different Eldrazi. 12 post Japan. Here we go. So there are things that I really like about this deck list and things that I think are unplayable. So this deck list has some really cool ideas that I think can be incorporated into the traditional Titan Post deck to make it better, but I think they've gone too far off the deep end. So I'm gonna probably have to read you some cards. Hour of Promise. Search your library for up to 2 land cards, then put them onto the battlefield tapped. There's this clause about doing stuff if you control deserts, but you don't, so we ignore that part. This is a double tutor into play. So I've been gushing about Golos this whole time because it finds you acceleration, it finds you a win condition in the form of Eye of Ugin, it finds you utility in whatever you have, whether it's Maze of Ith, Tabernacle, if you're a little, you know, wild and crazy. It can find so many things. Hour of Promise is like Golos twice in the same turn. You don't even have to use Golos and search for Caracas to Golos again. This just does it twice in one activation. So I think that Hour of Promise is actually really powerful, and if you're playing a green splash, this card is great. The question you have to be asking yourself is, what is my balance? Sorry, wrong deck list. What is my balance of that card versus my balance of Primeval Titan? Which costs just 1 more mana, but does the same thing while giving you a 6/6 body. Notably, Primeval Titan, though, is green-green. So if you look at like the vast number of forests that we're playing here, that's a huge dedication to green. This still has a lot of forests, but this deck list never requires green-green. Whereas the previous deck list requires green-green for both Primeval Titan and for Summoning Trap. So Hour of Promise is definitely a card that I think deserves more exploration than what it's getting in Legacy. But then there's some questionable things. I'm just going to shift the sideboard off screen. Like, let's get all this stuff on screen at the same time. There's Retrofitter Foundry, which essentially just lets you slowly create creatures that are increasingly bigger. This card is an annoyance for control decks, but aren't you already an annoyance for control decks? So I don't like Retrofitter Foundry in this shell at all. I also don't like Boom Pile. Flip a coin. If you win the flip, destroy all non-land permanents. I am not exaggerating. I believe on stream, my opponent had 2 boom piles in play and lost the coin flip 9 times in a row. Now that is an anecdote here, and statistically unlikely to occur, but I'm not sure that I want to be playing cards that rely on a literal coin flip to be good. Now, Boom Pile can do some really stupid things if you're a little bit lucky. But many of these other decks just play All Is Dust for a couple more mana or more copies of Ugin, and that's probably safer most of the time. The biggest place you'll probably see an advantage for Boom Pile is like a Delvar deck or something like that, where you're looking for something to help you survive to the mid to end game. And just like Boom Pile, get rid of your 2 Delvers, now I'm not under any pressure, can be absolutely huge for you. But like every time you miss one of those Boom Pile activations, like you might get lightning bolted or worse. So I'm not about that life. The last thing I don't really like about this deck list is the From Beyond. So this is at the beginning of your upkeep, you get a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi creature token that you can sacrifice for a mana. You can also pay 2 mana and sacrifice this to search for an Eldrazi card. This is an example of a card that does a lot of things, but isn't really the best at anything. So this is a very slow tutor. To get an Eldrazi, you need to spend effectively 6 mana, kind of 5 because you create a Scion during your first turn with it. The first turn, like, it makes it around the table. But that's a really expensive creature tutor. You know, we have other creature tutors in the format, and one that you can pretty consistently find with the other parts of your deck. Well, it also contributes to other parts of your game plan, so I don't love it. Since you're already amazing versus control decks, just creating the stream of 1/1s as if this is a Bitter Blossom isn't really what you need. So I'm not super on board with this card. You know, this could be a Golos, and you know I love me some Golos. Nope, come back, sideboard. I'm ready for you now. As far as the sideboard goes, like the previous green deck, this one has opted for Croson Grip's Veil of Summers, but this one has also played a spicy Life from the Loam. I believe Life from the Loam is kind of awkward in this shell, because you're also playing an Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. So you can run into some of these weird fringe situations where, like, you've dredged and you've hit your own Emrakul with Life from the Loam. So you have to be aware of that. And the other thing is that putting your lands into the graveyard is sometimes awkward because you lose the ability to tutor for them with things like Hour of Promise. So, like, let's say you dredge over your Eye of Ugin, and then your opponent Force of Negations your Life from the Loam and exiles it, or, like, surgically extracts your Life from the Loam, and you lose access to your Eye of Ugin. That is some scary stuff right there. So, you know, there are things to think about. You also have that extra copy of Boom Pile in your sideboard for when you really want to blow up your own Karn after you've tutored for Boom Pile. Alright, that's enough ripping on Boom Pile. I've said my piece. I guess final deck list thing. All of these decks are going to play some sort of Graveyard Hate, either Surgical Fairy or Leyline. I recommend Leyline personally. I've had great success with that card recently, especially against the various Breach builds. And I recommend Surgical the least against the Breach decks, which I believe is probably the premier combo deck of the format. I think a week or two ago, that title might have gone towards Blue-Green Show and Tell, but I think we've passed the stage where that's just like one of the best combo options. Against Breach, you want things that interact through silence, and Leyline of the Void comes into play before silence matters, and Fairy Macabre is one of the things that you can go and discard after they've played a silence. So you have that as a deck building consideration. But again, I really recommend Leyline of the Void personally. have had so much success with that card across multiple archetypes. All right, end section 1. So for my reference, recording time. Nope, I don't have a recording time. Oh, there it is. So it's about the 25-minute mark. All right, this video is going to be longer than I thought it was going to be. That's okay. It was a sizable donation. The support was appreciated. All right, section 2. Let's talk about the types of cards that are in your deck. And I'm going to use the Golos deck list for this, I think. Now let's use the traditional 12-post chalice one. It doesn't matter which one we use. I'll be talking about the same sorts of things. So in my mind, outside of the lands, there are 3 sorts of cards that exist in a 12-post deck. You have your protection cards, you have your bridge cards, and you have your finishers. Your protection cards are the things that keep you from losing the game. So these are obviously your hate pieces that keep your opponent from killing you before you can make it to the end game. But these are also your other defensive cards. Your Sorcerous Spyglass or your Pithing Needles, your Thought-Knot Seers. So anything that is going to stop your opponent's primary way of beating you is what I think of as your protection pieces. Most of the time, you are looking to protect your lands, because if you just keep making land drops, you're going to win against most Legacy decks. The longer the game goes, the more favored you are, overwhelmingly, against just about every deck in the format. So your protection cards keep you from dying, either because they protect the easiest ways that you can lose, such as Wasteland, or they slow down or stop your opponent's game plan enough to give you a window to make it to this stuff. Okay, section 2 is the bridge. The bridge is how you get to the fat. So your mana acceleration in various forms and your mid-rangey creatures are often serving as your bridge cards. So your candelabras, your monoliths, your manifold keys, your Thran dynamos, your Golos, if you're playing one of the green versions, your Elvish Rejuvenators. These are going to be the cards that increase your mana probably by 3 or more mana, either for a single turn or over the course of the game. And then finally, we get to your actual win conditions. And that's the stuff that's in this column here. With Karn kind of being in this awkward middle ground between being a protection / bridge card / win condition. Because in most of these decks, you're going to see Mycosynth Lattice and or Wormcoil Engine as things that you can potentially fish out, as well as Walking Ballista, so that, like, Karn can win you the game. Oftentimes, Karn is really more... So many columns. Karn is really more of a speed bump than anything else. It's a flexible speed bump, though. So your evaluation of Karn is going to vary from matchup to matchup. So, for example, against something like Delvar, you expect a Karn to hit, play, tutor up something, and then die immediately. Whereas versus Control, a resolved Karn might actually be a win condition in and of itself. All Is Dust is kind of weird, and it's one of those cards that doesn't cleanly fit into any of my 3 conceptual categories, because it's not exactly a win condition, even though it often functions as one. But it's not really a bridge card either, because it's not really helping you support to get to this, because you should be at the point where you can cast these already. If I had to throw it into one of them, like, I throw it into the bridge category, but it would be very begrudgingly that I put it there. So that's how I think of this deck. I think of it in 3 pieces. What are your protection cards that help you sort of, like, survive? What are your bridge cards that bring you to the end game? And what is your end game? Those are the various components I'm thinking of when I am building a Cloudpost deck. And so you might want to think about whether or not you have enough of each one of these things. And different versions of the deck are going to approach this same problem differently. Looking at the Golos deck, for example, if we look at the stuff that is really a bridge card in there, the candelabras and the manifold keys that this deck has maxed out on are really working towards bridging to the endgame. So is this. Whereas there's very little, relatively speaking, that is functioning as the protection cards. You're just looking to go bridge into endgame as quickly as possible and as consistently as possible. All right. So that's section 2. That's how I think of the cards. Section 3, opening hands, which kind of bleeds into this previous section. And this will occur at a little after the 30-minute mark. All right. When I'm looking for an opening hand, I am looking for 3 different things. Not all together, but I'm looking to be able to do at least one of these 3 things. Well, I have 3 things I'm thinking about in opening hands. So number 1, do I have a lock piece, a protection piece as I'm calling them, that is going to let me survive? Number 2, do I have the ability to go bigger than my opponent? And number 3, am I afraid of the clunk? So let's walk through those. Number 1, if your opening hand has the ability to play a lock piece, you have a greater chance of being able to draw out of any awkwardness that is in your hand. So, for example, let's say that your opening hand has a turn 1 Chalice of the Void off of Ancient Tomb. How much time is that going to buy you in the average Legacy matchup? 3 turns might be a fair estimate. So if you have a Chalice of the Void, like let's say your opening has like an Ancient Tomb, a Chalice of the Void, and a Cloud Post. But those are the only lands that you have. If that Chalice of the Void is going to buy you a few turns, then you have the ability to draw into the 24 lands that are remaining in your deck, a Grim Monolith. Once you have one other land, you get Dynamo turned on. If that other land was like a Soul Land or a Post, you get Golos turned on, and you gain the ability to play Magic. So your lock pieces in your opening hand allow you to be a little bit more safe in terms of keeping your hand. So when you're playing a which one had Needles main? So say you're playing this deck list, and like you have a Cloud Post opener, and those are your only lands. But you're going to get to play a Pithing Needle on turn 2 that prevents them from being wastelanded. All of a sudden, that's a little bit less scary. And it's even better if, say, it was Glimmer Post, Cloud Post instead. So you just go turn 1, Glimmer Post, Pithing Needle, and then you've played your Cloud Post once it's already protected. So if you have any sort of protection card, you can sort of keep a hand that's a little bit looser, knowing that your protection card is going to make it less likely that you're not going to play Magic. The next thing I'm looking for is the ability to go big. So let's say that my opening hand has like a Cascading Cataracts, an Eldrazi Temple, a Glimmer Post, and then like Golos, Ugin, All Is Dust, and Ulamog. Your opening hand doesn't actually give you the ability to go big. You have 3 lands, but you don't have the ability to go and cast the things that are critical to success. You're lacking in those protection cards. You're lacking in the bridge cards. So a lot of times you can throw back a hand that has a reasonable mix of lands and spells just because you have a good chance of not actually doing something with your opening hand. And this kind of leads into point number 3 here. When I am playing this deck, the way that I most frequently lose is to the clunk. That is when your hand isn't quite coming together because cards are getting stuck in your hand. So this deck has a lot of big cards in it that are going to be uncastable. This deck also has more columns in it than just about any other deck that I play. Your converted mana costs are spread literally between 0 and 15. So there's that. Alright, sorry, continuing back to that point. A lot of times, you will get stuck with a hand. And when you get stuck, you die with this deck. You will usually win if you keep hitting land drops, you keep accelerating your mana, and you work towards the inevitability you have. However, when you get stuck on 3 mana with this deck, just please take a look at what you can do. Okay, let's look at a different build. What can you do when you're stuck on 3 mana? This one? Well, this one's a little better. I guess we have more utility than normal here. But when you get stuck on mana in this deck, either because you've gotten wastelanded, or like because you've kept a risky hand and you're not making land drops, you're not accelerating in any way, these are the games where you most frequently die. If you resolve something that gets you an Eye of Ugin, you have probably won the inevitability game. But if you keep a hand that is a little mana light and is maybe reliant on one primary threat, one force of will, one piece of discard might end up getting you stuck. So when I'm evaluating my opening hand, I'm looking to see, do I have a lock piece that buys me time? Do I have the ability to go bigger than what my opponent is going to do? And am I afraid of getting stuck with this deck? So if any one of those answers is positive, my hand can probably be a keep. If I have a lock piece to buy time, we're good to go. If I have a very good chance of going bigger than my opponent without getting stuck, that's fine. And if I say, hey, this hand is reasonable, I'm likely not to get stuck on mana, then the hand can probably be a keep. But a lot of the in-between hands in this deck are pretty dicey. You can make a lot of mana on very few resources. So, especially if you're playing like these candle builds, 2 cloud posts plus a handful of candles and manifold keys can get pretty disgusting quickly. Alright. So this is now 37 and some change. Alright, so this is something that I've already sort of like kind of mentioned in passing, but now we're going to talk about game plans. That is, like, generally speaking, what am I looking to do against each macro archetype? And we're going to speak in big generalities here so that I keep this primer generic and useful over time. So we're not going to say this is the approach for blue-red Delvar versus Grixis Delvar versus blue-white-red Delvar or anything like that. This is just like macro archetypes. So what are you looking to do for control matchups? Can I get you all? I can get almost all of you. So versus control, you are looking to let your inevitability take over the matchup. Your control decks don't have that many answers to your cards, and many of your cards will keep coming back in one form or another. So you will be looking to outgrind control decks. The best way to do that is via threat density. As the game inevitably drags on, you will have plenty of mana. The question you need to ask is, do you have enough threats to beat them? So, Karn, acting as a threat, which either blows up their land and keeps them from advancing their own plan, or threatens to directly or indirectly end the game, is a threat in this matchup. Anything that fetches Eye of Ugin, even something as simple as a crop rotation, can become a threat in a control matchup. Because you searching up a creature every turn is devastating. Especially when some of those creatures, such as Ulamog and Emrakul, have cast triggers that probably aren't getting countered. So, the way you lose against control matchups is not having enough threats. So, if your threat in, like, say, turns... If in turns 1 through 5 you make a bunch of mana, but your only threat is like 1 Golos, and that gets countered, now you've reached the situation where you have gotten stuck, and you are at the mercy of the top of your deck. And Oko clocks fast. Jace, fate sealing you and keeping you from drawing into a threat, is similarly devastating. So against control, I will oftentimes keep a hand that is a little threat dense, but a little light on mana, because the situations where you win are often the ones where you have more threats than your opponent has Force of Wills, Counterspells, Force of Negation, that sort of stuff. Alternatively, any hand that has an Eye of Ugin and a decent amount of mana is probably fine too. The best case scenario for you in playing out a control matchup is actually where your opponent counters your early spells. So, from my perspective, in these matchups, Chalice of the Void, Trinisphere, Monoliths, Spyglass, even something like Thran Dynamo, I'm looking for all of these things to get countered so that when I make it to my later spells, they actually resolve. Now, if my Trinispheres and Chalice do resolve, that's all fine and dandy too, because that's also going to be constraining the control player in some other capacity. So, against control, you have the inevitability, and your opponent oftentimes has an anemic or non-existent clock. So, a Snapcaster Mage 10-turning you, not all that scary. An Oko or a Mentor hitting play, though, can threaten a decent amount of damage. So those are the sorts of threats that I'm more worried about. Should I do sideboarding as we go through with this? Yeah. So if you're looking to sideboard against against control, since you already have so much inevitability, you probably won't sideboard very much. You may have some things that are specifically for control, such as an Emrakul, and you may have some things that you board in just to replace something else in your deck. So, for example, if you expect the game to go very, very, very long, do you need quite as many pieces of mana acceleration? No. You can trim a little bit of mana against these decks, and you'll also have some things that might not line up well against a certain flavor of control. So, for example, if your opponent isn't playing very heavily to the board, something like All is Dust might not be nearly as good as it is in other matches, like, say, against Goblins, Death and Taxes, Merfolk, or something like that, where there's just, like, a huge spread of colored permanents out on the table. So, I would be looking to trim some mana acceleration and maybe some of your situational cards for more cards that are going to just have a strong impact on the game. Either more finishers, more lock pieces, something like that. But the thing that I'm most worried about in the control matchup is, what does my threat density look like? Alright, so which one was next? Combo? No, tempo. So, generally speaking, versus Delvar. Versus Delvar, you are looking not to die. Okay, yes, Phil, that makes sense. We know that. The biggest problem with Delvar is just getting wastelanded, or just getting, like, turn 1 Delvar, blind flip, I have 3 counter spells. You are looking to do everything that you can in order to maximize your chances of staying alive. The problem here is that some of your cards actually do not impact the board at all. In fact, many of them don't. So, oversimplifying, but basically, Key, Monolith, Spyglass, Trinisphere, Dynamo, Karn, none of these cards directly impact the threats that are already on the board. So that is your biggest weakness in any sort of Delvar matchup, is that many of your cards don't remove a threat, have no possibility of blocking a threat, do not interact with your opponent's cards. So, if your opponent can answer the first threat or two that you play, when you're not interacting with them, you are probably going to die to that. So oftentimes for any sort of Delvar matchup, I will be siding out my Karns and siding in the wish targets that I would have for those matchups. This can be a little bit awkward. So here's what I mean. You have an ensnaring bridge, which is often very good in game 1 versus Delver, when they don't have very many answers to it. Maybe a random Abrade, maybe a Brazen Borrower, or something like that. And so getting an ensnaring bridge into play can give you time to hide behind one of your planeswalkers and just, like, win the game. But in the post-sideboard games, where, hey, I already know that my Karns are kind of weak, I'm probably going to be boarding them out, what else can I do? So if we look at this sideboard for like a Delver matchup has a piece of removal, another slightly awkward piece of removal, maybe something to hide behind, maybe another lock piece. You can even consider boarding in the Worm Coil. So your Karns aren't really going to be ideal here since they're so slow. So if you consider like your opponent plays a Delver on turn 1 and blind flips it on their turn 2. You get attacked for 3, you probably get attacked for 3 again, you play a Karn, you get attacked for 3 again, you play a bridge, you might not be hellbent yet because you have all of these big awkward cards that are also in your hand, you get attacked for 3 more, then your bridge is active and you just get abraded or lightning bolted right out of the game. So against Delver, you're going to be looking to bring in more needle or spyglass effects if you have it to protect your lands. And you're also going to be looking to bring in your removal while boarding out your cards that have the lowest impact on the board. Another non-obvious thing about the matchup is that your Trinispheres are sometimes really bad for you. So in a vacuum, is Trinisphere good against Delver? Yes. Is it always good against Delver? Oh no. Oh no, 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 no. So this is a problem that Red Prison often has, where they go like Mountain on turn 1, turn 2, Ancient Tomb, Trinisphere, and then the Ancient Tomb gets wastelanded, and then they can't cast anything. This deck list has less of a problem with that, but let's compare this to the Golos Candle deck list, which has 14 cards under 3 CMC, or the Titan Rejuvenator one, which I think has 16. Yeah, which has 16. So oftentimes when I am on the draw versus Delver, I often end up trimming or cutting Trinispheres just because of how scary it is to get wastelanded when you're on the draw after you've played a Trinisphere. And you oftentimes don't have time to play a Trinisphere against a tempo deck when you're on the draw. So that's just something to keep in mind. And again, it is going to vary a little bit depending on what your build is. Like you might not have enough cards to bring in because of the Karn Wishboard. But it should be something that you're thinking about. Do I have the luxury of being able to board out Trinispheres when I'm on the draw? That'll be a little bit build dependent. So like if we look at this Golo stack, if we board out the Karns with this one, we could board in a Needle, we could board in a Ratchet Bomb, we could board in this, we could board in this, we can consider the bridges. And that gets rid of the slots that the Karns are in, and then maybe you trim a little bit of mana or something like that. But I suppose it's a moot point because this one doesn't have the Trinispheres that I'm talking about right now. But you hopefully get the general idea. Okay. What if you're playing against combo now? Let's get you all back on the screen. I guess that technically does it. No, I need the lands for this one. Okay. So you're playing against combo. If we look at this list, the chalice list, we do not have a Bojuka Bog in this list. So we actually don't have a relevant land to search for versus combo other than just like more mana. So we are going to be looking in a game 1 scenario to race combo most of the time. So in game 1, we have Chalice, Trinisphere, Thought-Knot Seer, which may be a little slow for some combo decks, and Sorcerer Spyglass for some combo decks. Generally speaking, the game 1 plan against combo is find one lock piece and then race them to something big and stupid before they can beat the lock piece. Let's take a matchup like Ant, Ad Nauseam Tendrils. An Ant deck can beat a chalice. It may take a few turns to set up. They might need to cast some cards into the chalice to get Hellbent for an Infernal Tutor. But a chalice on 0 or a chalice on 1, those are going to be totally beatable, given enough time. Can they beat a Trinisphere? Well, that one's going to be way harder in game 1, I think. Maybe not impossible, given enough Cabal rituals and maybe us tapping some Ancient Tombs, but it's certainly possible. Similarly, a Thought-Knot picking out the best card in their hand, or a Karn shutting off their mana, that's their artifact-based mana. Any one of these things is maybe not enough to win the game. So in a game 1 scenario, you are looking to create a speed bump and then capitalize on the speed bump. So are you maybe going to make it up to this level of mana? No, maybe not. But playing a bump in the road, followed by another bump in the road, those are going to be the stronger setups. So if you can take advantage of a Chalice of the Void to find you time to get to a Thought-Knot Seer, to find you time to get to an Ulamog blowing up 2 of their lands, that's a better path to victory. You can't just expect one hate piece to beat most combo decks. Different example, but yesterday on stream, or when I was recording, I was playing Death and Taxes versus Breach. And I played a hate card on turn 1, turn 2, and turn 3, and then died on turn 4. My opponent answered all 3 of them and then comboed off. So you cannot rely on one combo piece giving you infinite time. This is the infinite time and I win deck, but you don't have that against combo. For the post-sideboard games, you're going to be looking to board in almost all of your hate pieces. I say almost because you do need to respect Karn giving you access to some of the things in your sideboard. So, for example, you may end up leaving something like 1 Tormod's Crypt in the sideboard that you can wish for, just so you have an extra piece of hate from the Karn. As of right now, Karn is hating on a lot of combo decks directly. So against the Breach decks, it's stopping Lotus Petal and Lion's Eye Diamond. But say you're playing against some different deck, like a Show and Tell deck or something like that, you're not necessarily getting huge full value out of your Karns unless you leave a target for them. So you'll often see like a Tormod's Crypt, maybe an extra Trinisphere, an extra Chalice, or something like that in the board. When you play against a combo deck, you're really hoping they're also a graveyard-based combo deck, because Leyline of the Void, or Surgical, or Fairy often makes up the majority of the sideboard hate cards for these decks. As far as things that you're looking to board out, something like All is Dust or other removal spells that you're playing in the main deck are usually going to be dead, and your Planeswalkers are really not as great versus combo. Thought-Knot Seer and Golos attack, and they get your opponent dead. But if you kind of think about the clock from an Ugin, this is 2 damage, followed by 4 damage, followed by 6 damage. And that's fine and all, but a Thought-Knot Seer is way more threatening, right? At least Ugin is a lightning bolt every turn. But even then, like, you'd much rather just 2-turn your opponent with something like this, or get multiple attacks off of something that's also disruptive. Against combo, I do not keep medium hands, medium 7-card hands. I try to aggressively mulligan against combo to hands that have 2 pieces of hate in the opener. So I'll pitch a 6-card hand that is just like totally dead to 1 piece of counter interaction from my opponent. So say I have a hand with a turn 1 Chalice of the Void, but then just a bunch of stuff at the top end of my curve, I would probably try to find something that was a little bit safer. So against a lot of the decks of the format right now, a Leyline plus a Chalice in an opener is just like chef's kiss good. And anything else you get beyond that is the icing on the cake. Let's see. I think that's probably all I want to say versus combo. Oh yeah, and things like Walking Ballista, where they're really there to pick off small creature decks or to serve as another like finisher in the late game when you have like 15 mana with a Cloud Post. Those are also going to be pretty weak versus combo. One final thing to keep in mind about combo. If you're playing against a combo deck that is very weak to Pithing Needle or Sorceress Spyglass, consider boarding one of those out to have as a Karn tutor target. So for example, you're playing against a Depths deck. If you have 4 Pithing Needles, you can consider boarding one out, maybe when you're on the play only though, so that you can have access to them via Karn. That will again depend on what you are bringing in. Essentially, if the Karn is remaining in your deck, you need to have at least one critical card in the sideboard that you want to be looking for. If your Karn package is effectively just like LED liquid metal coating and mycosynth lattice, that's maybe a weak Karn, and you're not leaving yourself with the options that actually like savagely cripple your opponent. All right, what's my timestamp now? We are at about 56 minutes. All right, so that's the end of sort of like our game plan plus like rough sideboarding and mulliganing. So let's talk about overall thoughts of this deck in the current metagame. And this is the one section that is not necessarily going to age well. So everything else before this is relatively universal. Some of your exact cards, your exact configurations are going to be changing over time, but they should still be pretty useful to you. So when I'm thinking about Legacy right now, I'm thinking about Chalice of the Void decks. I'm thinking about Oko decks. Let's get those on screen. And I'm thinking about Breach decks. Those are kind of the 3 things that are on my mind. So when I think about Chalice of the Void decks, I really like my positioning being the 12-post deck. You have a deck that largely ignores an opposing Chalice. Certain builds will be slightly more vulnerable to an opposing Chalice. But in Game 1 situations, if your opponent plays a Chalice, you just go, oh, okay. Your opponent plays a Trinisphere, you go, oh, that's okay. And you actually get to ignore a lot of your opponent's stuff. If you're playing against something like Red Prison, you might think that Blood Moon is just going to be like the actual factual nuts against them, but that's not really true. You have Grim Monolith and Thran Dynamo that give you explicit colorless mana if you need to cast something like a Thought-Knot Seer that's in your hand. And Red Prison is often very slow to kill. When you don't just have a Rabblemaster or a Chandra in play right after or right before you play a lock piece, they sometimes just play draw go for a couple of turns, hoping that their lock piece buys enough time. What deck has inevitability again as the game goes really long? Is this one. Is this one right here. So, keeping that in mind, as you go long against a deck like Red Prison or another Chalice deck, you often have the trump cards over time that are going to beat them. So that's okay. Of all the Chalice decks in the metagame, you should be most afraid of 4 to 5 color Loam, because they can turn your mana accelerators into Elks. And they have a wasteland machine called Knight of the Reliquary that's really difficult to beat if you don't have a Sorceress Spyglass or Pithing Needle to stop it. But otherwise, your traditional Chalice decks are not all that scary. Loam, scary. Okay, what about the Oko decks? Against a lot of the Oko decks, you're going to have the inevitability versus them. So many of your artifacts are not going to do what you want them to do, and that ends up being okay. But if you get to buy some time, get a Golos or a Thought-Knot in play, so like you force your opponent to Oko some of your stuff instead of just like going food, create dude, food, create dude, food, create dude, over the next couple of turns, if you force them to interact with your stuff, you're often just buying time to get to the things that are going to beat an Oko. You know, this hits play, it beats an Oko. You cast this, it beats an Oko. Cast that and resolve it, it beats an Oko. Hey, what's more than one colors? Oko. So you can beat all these things as you go along, and most, not all, but most of your Oko decks are not going to have wastelands. If you do run into something like, say, a bug Delvar deck that is playing like both wasteland and Oko, they fall into more of the tempo category, but like just since we're talking about, you know, the boogeyman of the format, maybe that's Breach now. Anyway, but a lot of times when you're playing against these Oko, they can't disrupt your lands, so they can only counter your spells, make you discard, you know, kind of deal with your permanents or cards in hand or on the stack. Okay. Sorry, this is the part that I'm doing sort of on the cuff here. It's something I thought of as I was doing the rest of the video. So I think combo is, I guess, the other portion now. So against the combo decks of the format right now, I really like decks that have leyline and multiple pieces of game 1 hate. Some of the 12-post lists fall into that category, where you do have Chalice, you do have Trinisphere, you do have Leyline. But certain versions of this deck are going to be way, way softer to combo than you would like. So for example, while I love this list against a room full of control players, like, you know, would like theoretically bet the farm on it. If you play the same deck list versus a room full of control, or sorry, a room full of combo, that's way scarier, right? So when you're thinking about what list am I going to play for this weekend, you need to be looking at the immediate results. If you're scared of Breach, maybe this isn't the build for you, and you need something that has Chalices and Trinispheres in the main deck. But if you go like, no, you know, Breach didn't put up any results after leaving a legacy open, you know, I don't know if it's really as good as people are saying it is, so I'm going to play something a little bit more mid-rangey and try to beat out, you know, all those Oko piles, then yeah, something like this might end up giving you a little bit more utility. So we've hit about the hour mark, which is kind of the longer end of what I wanted this video to be. But, you know, you start talking about Chalice decks, and I don't really shut up. So I hope this has been useful to you. This was not meant to be a, here is exactly how you sideboard, here's what I do for each one of these matches. This was instead meant to be sort of a deep dive on what are the various versions of 12-post right now, and sort of what does it, how do I build my 12-post deck to an attack a metagame? Like, what sort of things do I need to be thinking about? This was meant to be a deep dive that allows you to see what I'm thinking about when I'm playing all of these Chalice decks like this one. I think it's really easy for people to dismiss Chalice decks like, oh, yeah, you just got a bunch of money. You just got a bunch of mana and you won the game. Or you just had the hate piece and you had it. But as you can see, there's a huge amount of variety in this archetype. There's a lot of nuance here when it comes to like what you are going to play in any given weekend. And each one of your choices has a huge ramification on how your matchups are going to play out and what other cards can go into your deck. You probably don't want to be playing Chalice of the Void alongside your Candles. If you're going to be playing a full playset of Manifold Key, you really need to make sure you're doing things that support it. Oh, and just, like, I know you probably know, but just in case, Manifold Key also has this sneaky second ability that makes it better than Voltaic Key, in that target creature can't be blocked this turn. A lot of people forget that until they leave back a blocker and suddenly die to, like, an Ulamog or a Thought-Knot Seer or a Giant Walking Ballista getting through that they expected to be able to block. So just, like, this ability exists. You're not going to use it often, like, maybe 1 in 15 or 20 games or something like that. But when you do use it, it probably wins you the game on the spot. The last word of caution I will have for you in building a 12-post list is you don't have to get cute with your deck list in order to win. You are playing a shell that is extremely powerful. And you don't need to just play cards for the sake of trying things out. So I see a lot of people shoving weird overcosted cards into 12-post decks because they can, because you have the mana to do it. Just because you have the mana to cast some cards doesn't mean that you should. A lot of times being like lean, elegant, and efficient with your deck building is better than giving yourself fringe outs to weird sorts of scenarios that you come across. This is one of the ones that I saw from a recent list where I looked at that and I thought, yeah, that's too cute. Like, cut that for something better. And that's Labyrinth of Scophos. So it taps for a colorless, or you can pay 4 to remove target attacking or blocking creature from combat. So this is Maze of Ith that taps for a mana, but if you want to use the Maze of Ith portion of it, you pay 4 mana and tap this. So, is that really worth it? Is that doing what you want it to be doing in this deck? And I'm really skeptical that the answer is yes. So you don't need to get super cute with your deck building. You're playing very, very powerful cards in the first place. So I lean on the side of playing more copies of the powerful cards before I get cute with things like, where are you? Boom pile. All right. With that jab, I think that's going to do it for this video. So I hope you have enjoyed my primer, which kind of ended up being sort of like a random podcast episode on 12-post. I hope you enjoyed it, made it through your workday a little bit happier or something like that. And if you want me to do a deep dive / primer on another archetype, that's something that I'm always considering. I'll throw the information for that below in the video. Cheers, folks. I hope you have a great rest of the day.